You ever tell someone something personal, something deep, something raw, and then instantly regret it? Maybe they didn't even do anything with it. They just looked at you different, and right there, you knew you'd said too much. There are things you should never tell anybody, not because they're evil or wrong, but because most people can't hold them without distorting them. Carl Jung, one of the most misunderstood minds in modern psychology, didn't make a tidy list, but if you really read his work, not just the quotes floating around online, you'll see it. A quiet warning: the unconscious is powerful, the self is layered, and oversharing, even with good intentions, can collapse something fragile inside you. This isn't about being secretive or manipulative, it's about survival, dignity, privacy. Some truths don't belong on the table, not until you know who's sitting across from you. So today, we're going to talk about 6 kinds of truths that Jung would argue you should guard, things you might be tempted to spill during a late-night conversation, an argument, a moment of desperation, but that could come back twisted. Not every story deserves an audience. Not every wound should be shown. Before we go into them, we have to understand the man behind these ideas, not the textbook version. The man who spent his life exploring the murky parts of the mind, the places we don't even want to admit exist. Let's slow down for a second and talk about the man behind all this, Carl Jung. You've probably heard his name thrown around next to words like shadow work, ego death, or individuation, especially online. But Jung wasn't some spiritual influencer. He was a psychiatrist who spent decades digging into the dark, tangled parts of the human mind most people avoid. He believed every person carries a self made up of pieces, some visible, some buried. What you see in the mirror, that's just a sliver. The rest is what he called the shadow, your repressed fears, guilt, desires, shame. And here's the thing. Jung believed that spilling all of this to others without understanding it yourself first doesn't set you free. It actually weakens you. Why? Because when you give someone access to a part of you that you haven't fully integrated yet, you hand them a distorted version of your truth. And they can't help but judge it, reduce it, or misinterpret it. There's a quote from Jung that cuts deep here. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. So imagine how unlikely it is that they'll be able to hold yours with care. This is where the modern obsession with being transparent gets tricky. Social media thrives on vulnerability as currency. Post your trauma, tell your story, be raw. But Jung would have told you, disclosure without discernment is a kind of self-abandonment. You're not being real. You're scattering parts of yourself into hands that were never meant to carry them. And no, this doesn't mean be fake or guarded all the time. It means you have to ask yourself, why am I sharing this? What do I want from this person? Validation, relief, power, connection. Because if you don't know your motive, someone else will define it for you. We live in a culture that mistakes openness for courage. But courage, real courage, sometimes looks like keeping things to yourself. Not forever, not out of fear, but because they're still forming, still sacred, still yours. So, when we talk about the 6 things you should never tell anybody, it's not about shame, it's about choosing what deserves protection. And we're about to start with the first one, the one most people give away without even realizing the cost. Let's start with the first thing you should never tell just anybody, your deepest insecurity. Think about it. The thing you hate about yourself, the thing you fear people already see, even when they say nothing. Maybe it's how you look. Maybe it's something you did years ago. Maybe it's a feeling you can't shake, the quiet belief that you're not enough or that you're somehow fundamentally flawed. Now, here's the part most people miss. When you confess that insecurity to someone who hasn't earned your trust, you aren't opening up. You're handing them the sharpest part of yourself and hoping they don't drop it, or worse, throw it back at you when they're angry. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. How many times has someone been real with a friend or partner, only to have that same vulnerability turned against them later? Sometimes it's subtle, a backhanded comment. Sometimes it's weaponized in an argument. Either way, the damage sticks. And here's where Jung's thinking becomes really relevant. He believed that the things we repress, the things we hide or deny, become part of the unconscious shadow. Not because they're evil, but because they're painful to face. But dumping those parts onto someone else before you've even processed them doesn't bring healing. It spreads confusion. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That applies here. If you share a deep insecurity before you've made peace with it, even a little, it can end up shaping how others see you. Worse, it shapes how you see yourself in their eyes. You start searching their reactions for confirmation. Do they think less of you now? Do they pity you? Do they agree with your fear? Let me give you a real-world example. There's a woman I spoke to recently, mid-30s, smart, thoughtful, deeply insecure about her weight. She'd made a lot of progress on her self-image. But then, in a vulnerable moment with a guy she was dating, she blurted out how ashamed she felt about her body. He reassured her in the moment, said the right things. But a few weeks later, when they argued, he made a passing joke about not being her therapist. That was it. She shut down. Everything she had worked to rebuild inside her cracked. That one comment wasn't just rude. It echoed her worst fear, that she was too much. And because she'd handed him that insecurity too soon, without boundaries, it hit harder. So ask yourself, why am I telling this person this thing? Do I want to connect? Or do I want to be rescued? And what happens if they can't handle it? There's nothing wrong with talking about your insecurities, but talk about them in safe places, with people who've shown they're capable of holding that weight without dropping it. And even then, only when you've held it first. Let's talk about the second thing you should never tell just anybody, your true ambition. Not the polished version you mentioned during interviews or post about online. I'm talking about the thing you actually want, the thing you quietly hope for when no one's watching, the goal that feels so personal, it's almost embarrassing to admit. Why is that something to keep private? Because people don't hear your ambition. They hear their fear, their jealousy, their cynicism, filtered through your words. If you tell someone your dream before it's had time to root, their reaction can shake it loose, and that damage can linger longer than you think. Carl Jung understood how fragile identity is when it's still being formed. He once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Ambition is tied to that. Real ambition isn't a plan, it's an inner confession of who you believe you could be. And the moment you say it out loud, it becomes vulnerable to interpretation, mockery, dismissal. Here's what that looks like in real life. Imagine someone who wants to leave a stable job to pursue photography. They tell their co-workers, their friends, even their partner. Most people respond with subtle discomfort. But what about job security? Or you're really going to give up a salary for that? Nobody's being cruel. They're just speaking from their frame. But suddenly, that dream doesn't feel like freedom anymore. It feels reckless, unrealistic, maybe even stupid. And now that person starts second-guessing not just the ambition, but themselves. Not because it wasn't right, but because they let other people carry it before they could. There's also another layer, projection. When you say what you really want, people often respond based on how much they've given up on what they wanted. That's not your fault, but it becomes your burden if you let it shape your direction. So should you keep your dreams completely secret? But be intentional. Share them with people who understand the weight of risk and still root for you. People who won't look for the flaws first. Ask yourself, is this dream still becoming real to me? Or am I saying it out loud so someone else will believe in it before I do? If it's the second one, don't speak yet. Build in silence. Let the thing become real inside you before you invite someone else into it. Because the world doesn't always respond with applause, and ambition, when exposed too early, can start to sound like a question instead of a statement. Now let's move to the third thing you should never hand out freely, your past regrets. Everyone's got something they wish they hadn't done, a moment they wish they could erase or at least redo. And when we talk about healing or growth, it's easy to assume that the more you share, the more you heal. But regret is tricky, because it doesn't just live in memory, it lives in shame. And shame doesn't always shrink when you speak it. Sometimes it multiplies. Here's the danger. When you offer someone your regret, what you're really offering is your unfinished business. If they can't hold it with maturity, and most people can't, they'll reshape how they see you, even if they say they don't, even if they pretend not to care. Carl Jung didn't believe in hiding from the past, but he also warned that digging into your shadow should be done with care. You don't just rip open old wounds in public and expect others to understand the depth of your healing. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." He wasn't saying broadcast your darkness. He meant face it first, own it, then choose carefully who you bring into that space. Let me give you something real. A guy in his 20s once confided in someone he'd just started dating. He shared that he used to lie compulsively in high school. Not little white lies, but serious ones that got people hurt. He said he'd changed, and maybe he had. But after a while, anytime they had a disagreement, she'd bring it back up. Not directly, but through doubt. Are you sure you're being honest? This kind of reminds me of what you said you used to do. It didn't matter that it had been years. In her mind, that regret had become a lens, and in his mind, her reaction became confirmation that he should have kept it to himself. You have to ask yourself, why do I feel the need to confess this? Am I asking for forgiveness or permission? Do I need understanding, or do I just want to be seen? There's no shame in regretting things, but the way you carry those regrets can either rebuild you or haunt you. They don't need to be hidden, but they need to be healed before you hand them to someone else. Because if they're not, you're not sharing a memory, you're leaking an open wound and hoping the person in front of you has clean hands. Now we get into territory that feels a little messier, your family's flaws. It's tempting, right? Especially when you're getting close to someone. You start telling stories, unpacking your past, and before you know it, you're laying out the full history of who hurt you, who failed you, who made your childhood harder than it needed to be. And it feels like bonding, like honesty, but what actually happens is more subtle and more dangerous. Because once you expose the cracks in your family to someone else, they don't just see your relatives differently, they start seeing you through those cracks. That judgment you cast, even if it's justified, can bleed into how they interpret your habits, your reactions, your patterns. Carl Jung had a name for this undercurrent, the collective unconscious. It's the idea that we're all carrying generational material, ancestral beliefs, wounds, secrets, whether we realize it or not. When you talk about your family, you're not just giving someone a character profile, you're revealing part of your psychological DNA. And if the person you're telling doesn't understand nuance, they'll reduce everything to a narrative. Your mum was overbearing? You must be emotionally stunted. Your dad walked out? You probably have trust issues. Suddenly, your entire emotional identity is being filtered through their second-hand interpretation of people they've never met. There's also the question of loyalty. Not blind loyalty, but spiritual loyalty. The idea that even when a family dynamic is broken, it still shaped you. When you badmouth that system too casually, it disconnects you from part of your own foundation. And if the relationship ever falls apart, whether it's romantic or platonic, you can't unsay what you said. You can't undo the way they now perceive your bloodline. Let me put this into perspective. A woman I know was deeply hurt by her father growing up. He wasn't physically abusive, but he was dismissive, emotionally absent, and critical. She opened up about this to someone she was seeing, thinking it was a safe space. For a while, it was, but during a tense moment he said, "You're just like your dad. You shut down when things get hard." It stung, not because it was true, but because he'd taken something sacred, something she was still healing from, and used it as a shortcut to explain her behavior. So ask yourself, am I sharing this because I need to be heard? Or because I'm hoping they'll fix the part of me that my family couldn't? If it's the second one, you're setting them up to fail and setting yourself up to be misunderstood. Family is complicated. The stories are rarely black and white. And once you let someone else into those stories, you don't control how they retell them, even if it's only in their mind. Next up, your financial status or struggles. This one might not seem as emotionally charged as the others at first glance, but it cuts deep in ways people rarely admit. Money, how much you make, how much you owe, how much you lack, is one of the most intimate things about you. Not because it defines your worth, but because it exposes your choices, your fears, your habits, your vulnerabilities. And once someone else knows that information, you can't ungive it. You don't just risk being judged, you risk being reduced. Carl Jung didn't write extensively about money, but he understood projection. And financial projection is one of the most common and subtle ways people judge each other. You say you're broke, and someone hears irresponsible. You say you're wealthy, and they hear privileged. Either way, they're responding to a story in their head, not yours. And it happens fast. You mention that you're in debt, maybe student loans, maybe something heavier. You say it casually, like it's no big deal. But after that, every time you hesitate to go out or spend money, it's framed by that detail. Oh, they're just cheap because they're broke. Or the opposite. You reveal that you're doing well financially and suddenly your problems get downplayed. Must be nice. You can't be that stressed. You've got money. A man I know was doing freelance work full-time. Business was slow for months, and he had to borrow money to cover rent. He told a few friends, not to ask for help, just to be real. One of them started treating him like he was fragile, offering advice constantly, making snide remarks about how everyone's struggling these days. Another friend just went silent. She stopped inviting him to events, probably assuming he couldn't afford it. He wasn't ashamed of being broke. What hurt was how quickly people shifted their behavior based on that single detail. Like everything else about him suddenly came with an asterisk. So why keep your financial status private? Because money activates people's insecurities, their envy, their assumptions, and none of that has anything to do with you. But once you've shared that part, their perception shifts, sometimes quietly, sometimes permanently. That doesn't mean never speak about money, but ask yourself, do I trust this person to separate my finances from my identity? Can they hear this without turning it into a measure of my character? If you're not sure, stay silent, because once people know how much you have, or don't, they stop seeing you. They see a number. Last on this list, your spiritual beliefs or experiences. Now this one's a little different. It's not about shame. It's about being misunderstood in a way that can shake something sacred loose. When someone has a spiritual experience, a real one, it usually doesn't come with clear language. It might feel like clarity or presence or something invisible breaking open. But try putting that into words and watch how quickly it starts to sound strange or dramatic or worse, delusional. Carl Jung had a deep respect for spirituality. He didn't treat it like fluff or fantasy. He saw it as the foundation of the psyche's inner life. He believed that we all have a symbolic world inside us, filled with dreams, myths, and archetypes, and that spiritual experiences often show up as moments when that hidden world pushes through. But he also warned against sharing those experiences with people who don't have the framework to understand them. He wrote, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego." Think about that. The self, your deeper self, shows up when your ego finally takes a back seat. But most of the world is still speaking from ego. So when you describe a moment of stillness, a vision, or a spiritual shift, it might sound, to them, like you've lost grip. That disconnect can be painful. Not just because they don't get it, but because you start questioning what you felt in the first place. Was it real? Was it just emotion? Am I just being too sensitive? And here's the thing. Spirituality is not just religion. It could be something as quiet as feeling deeply connected to nature, or having a dream that stayed with you for weeks, or a moment during grief where time bent and something unexplainable showed up. These moments don't always belong in conversation, especially not with people who only think in straight lines. I've seen this happen. A man I knew lost his sister suddenly. Months later, he told a colleague that he'd had a dream where she spoke to him. Nothing dramatic, just a moment where he felt her presence. He wasn't trying to convince anyone. He just shared it because it felt meaningful. The colleague gave him a half smile and changed the subject. But after that, their tone toward him changed. He wasn't treated like someone grieving. He was treated like someone fragile. That dream mattered, but saying it out loud made it smaller, or worse, made him smaller in their eyes. So here's the question. Do you really need someone else to understand that moment? Or are you hoping their validation will make it more real? Because some things become weaker when exposed too soon, not because they're wrong, but because they weren't meant for common air. Some things belong only to you. By now, you've probably noticed a thread running through all of this. It's not that you should never speak your truth. It's that you should know who you're speaking to, why you're speaking, and whether that truth is even ready to be shared. Silence isn't about secrecy. It's about respect, both for yourself and for the parts of you that are still unfolding. There's a pressure these days to be open about everything. Oversharing has somehow become a form of currency, proof that you're honest, that you're brave, that you're self-aware. But Carl Jung wasn't interested in performance. He believed that real self-awareness doesn't need to prove anything. It's quieter than that. It knows when to speak and when to hold. He once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And becoming that person takes time. It takes discernment. Not every part of you is meant to be unpacked in front of an audience. Some parts need solitude, some need years, some may never need to be spoken at all. Ask yourself this: what parts of me have I offered too freely? And what did it cost? Was it relief or regret? Did the other person hold it or drop it? Not everyone you trust is capable of understanding you fully. And that's okay. It's not their job. It's yours. To know what's yours to keep and what's ready to be seen. This isn't about closing yourself off. It's about creating a space where your story is safe enough to grow, not shaped by someone else's reaction, but by your own clarity. You don't owe people your inner life just because they ask. You don't have to reveal your pain to be real. You don't have to bleed publicly to be valid. Silence, when it comes from knowing, is not withholding. It's wisdom. You've heard the 6, not warnings, not rules, but quiet truths about what deserves protection. Things you don't owe to anyone, things that lose something when handled by the wrong hands. Carl Jung wasn't concerned with being open for the sake of it. He believed in depth, in integration, in becoming whole, not through constant exposure, but through intentional silence, through knowing the difference between what is personal and what is sacred. And in a world obsessed with being seen, where every pain is turned into content and every thought is shared out loud, that kind of knowing is rare. You don't have to turn yourself inside out to be real. You don't have to explain everything you've been through to be valid. You don't have to let people into every corner of your mind to prove you've done the work. Some parts of you are still growing, still fragile, still yours. So before you speak, ask yourself, is this truth ready to be shared? Or am I still learning how to carry it? Maybe you've already given away something that should have stayed close. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. But now, you know better. And knowing better is how you stop repeating the cycle. Silence isn't a failure to connect. Sometimes it's how you stay connected to yourself. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What part of you have you been giving away too easily? And what would it look like to take it back? Let me know in the comments. And if this spoke to something in you, share it with someone who might need it too.